Thank you again, Jesse, for inviting me to be a part of this symposium and to hear and learn more about what you've been doing over the past 3 years. It's been really fascinating today. And as was just stated, my perspective is shaped by my own research. I was fortunate to work pretty closely with Bob Bringle, who's done a lot of work in the area of international service learning, Susan Sutton, who's done a lot of work with global learning, as well as many Africanist scholars. So that's one perspective I bring, but the other perspective is one of someone who is out on campuses all over the U.S. So I have a wonderful opportunity to work with 2-year colleges, 4-year colleges, highly selective, open access, to see what people are doing around global learning and what types of innovations are happening and working with them. So that will shape the perspective that I bring today. Before I get into the reflections of what I heard last night and what I've heard today, I'd just like to start by almost stating the obvious. And it's that we are truly living in a time of great complexity and great change. I like to start with a song from Hamilton the musical. I'm very fortunate. My cousin played George Washington. He was the original George Washington. So all of us have gone to see the show at least once, if not twice, just to, of course, he didn't give us free tickets. He made it very clear. We had to, go through proper channels. But there's a line from the song that says, look around at how lucky we are to be alive right now. Look around at how lucky we are to be alive. And, I at one point I thought, I don't know that I feel lucky to be living right now with everything that's going on. But then I thought it's a time of great potential. It's a time for us to show who we are. It's a time for us to prepare students to engage with these real complex challenges that they're facing. And so I'd just like to start with a few things that we've seen and why our work is even more important now than maybe it was 5-10 years ago. We've all seen Brexit and, of course, the subsequent vote in the UK a couple of days ago. We've seen inward-looking nationalist governments developing or people moving in that direction. We've seen the rise of populism. We've seen executive orders in our own country that have attempted to restrict, the entry of folks from predominantly Muslim countries into the U.S. And there have been occurrences of harassment of people due to race, religion, other factors all around the world. And it's a time that our students are engaging in these challenges on a daily basis in many cases, on and off campus. And it makes the work that we are doing even more critical. And it makes it even more important that we are giving all students an opportunity to participate and to figure out how to navigate these complex situations. So I'd like to share a couple of publications that have come out recently. AAC&U is the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers, and they did a survey of admissions officers and contacts in the international realm to talk about what foreign nationals who may come to the U.S. are feeling right now. They conducted the survey in February of 2017. And they worked with NAFSA, IIE, the College Board, and the National Association for College Admissions Counseling. And one of the findings they found was that, and this will not be surprising to you, international student recruitment professionals reported hearing a great deal of concern from students, primarily from the Middle East, 79% of those students, 46% India, and 36% Asia, excluding China and India, and then following Latin America with about 30%. And one of the most frequent concerns was the perception that the climate in the U.S. was now less welcoming to individuals from other countries. Another concern that they raised was that this executive order travel ban might be expanded to other countries. And so they didn't want to get here and then be on that list and forced to leave. When you look at the other factors, regardless of region, immigration and policy changes, feeling unwelcome, political factors, those were also other concerns that were raised. Now, they acknowledge that this doesn't mean that there will definitely be an overall decline in international student enrollment, but we should be prepared. And I don't know if any of you are in that area or if you've seen some decline on your campuses, but we've worked with a number of institutions that are seeing small declines. Another example is Princeton's president wrote after the first executive order that immigration has been a source of creativity and strength for this country throughout its history. It is indispensable to the mission of excellence of American universities, which enhance this country's economy, security, and well-being. He, of course, wasn't the only president that wrote out in this. Many presidents, many campuses, many business partners, many people in communities wrote out to talk about the benefit that we gain from having international students and scholars on our campuses and in our communities. And many of you may be familiar with the hashtag "You Are Welcome Here" that was started out of Temple and has spread across the country. And finally, last month, former Secretary of State General Colin Powell wrote an op-ed for the New York Times that you may have seen. And he wrote about this changing political environment, and he argued that, indeed, we are the strongest when the face of America isn't only a soldier carrying a gun, but also a diplomat negotiating peace, a Peace Corps volunteer bringing clean water to a village, or a relief worker stepping off a cargo plane as floodwaters rise. And these are just a few of the pathways that some of the students who go through our programs will take, and we want them to be ready, and we want them to still have an interest in doing this. So I just wanted to set that context as we move forward and look and reflect on some of the things that we've talked about. So first, just a quick refresher. Everybody knows what high impact practices are. Yes, we don't need to beat these. So again, these are highly tested practices that are shown to be beneficial for students from many backgrounds, but particularly new majority students. And I think it's important that we take just a minute to look at how diverse new majority students are. And new majority is a term that some people use. Others say underserved, others say underrepresented. There are a wide range of terms. But I think it's important that we look at the complexity. And sometimes we may think, oh, all first-generation students come from poverty, or all students of color come from poverty. But there's great diversity in the backgrounds of the students in terms of their economics, in terms of their experience or understanding of higher education. These may be students who have been coming to universities for years, whether or not their parents went to college. And so I think it's important that we think about how diverse this group is. Many refer to our returned military servicemen in this category, non-traditional age students. So it's really important that we think about these groups as we're thinking about advancing this research and work that you are doing. So of course, the list of high impact practices that you know very well, of course, the e-portfolios were added. George Koo used his magic wand and endorsed the e-portfolio recently. And we've already seen some examples, and I'll mention that, of where people are putting the practices together. But the thing about high impact practices, and you know this more than most people, is they're not magical. And just because you have a student go abroad, or just because you have a student do a study away in a diverse community, or just because you have students engage in service, doesn't mean that it is going to be high impact. And thankfully, Neil addressed that the other day. He said, what are we talking about? How do we know that these are high impact? And so we have worked with colleagues to look at some quality dimensions that can make high impact practices high impact. And I hope many of you have seen this as well. Many of you talked about this in some of the work that you did. You know, one thing that's important is significant investment of time and effort for students, interaction between faculty and peers about substantive matters that came up earlier, and who are the students talking to about these experiences they're having. Frequent, timely, and constructive feedback that students are actually engaging. They don't have one reflective activity over the course of an experience, but they have multiple, and they're able to discuss their experiences with their faculty as well as with their peers. There isn't sort of this idea that when I'm with my peers, I just talk about going to the bars or going to the pubs or going to get cloth made or things like that, but you have conversations about what's going on. Another thing that's important is this idea of relevance through real-world application, and this is absolutely essential, is that students are in the real world doing things, and then also experiences with diversity. But what do we ultimately know about high-impact practices? There may be a publication that you're familiar with. This came out in 2013, and this is Assessing Underserved Students' Engagement in High-Impact Practices. You can download this from AAC&U's website if you haven't seen it. They use NESI data, so you understand what the limitations or what the strengths of that data set are. And they found that students viewed that their participation in multiple high-impact practices did result in more learning. I think we will be waiting for additional research from Maureen, Cynthia, Amy, and Nosipo to help strengthen this case. So this is an area where it would be nice to have additional research on if students are engaging in multiple high impact practices, what are the outcomes? Are they learning more? How do we know it? And so I think that's definitely an area that will be very, very helpful. We also know, and we've talked significantly, so I didn't want to take a lot of time and add this, we've talked about the other benefits of study abroad, but from the perspective of the institutions oftentimes, they focus on graduation and retention. And so they want to know, will students graduate in a timely manner? Do their GPAs go up? Is there learning? And so there's evidence that when students study abroad, they tend to graduate in 4 years in many cases, and their GPAs tend to be higher, and students report overall improved learning. Now, many people have questioned this and said, well, the students who go abroad, are they already better students anyway? So that's something that can be researched and unpacked in different institutional contexts, but that's the information that we have. Now, when it came to NESE, were you all familiar that NESE added a global learning module in 2016? Okay, some, and I don't usually do commercials. This isn't a real commercial because this is a free product. But the upcoming issue of Liberal Education, it's an AAC publication. You can go to our website and get it if you don't get the hard copy. Jillian Kenzie wrote an article about this NESE global module. So I'm going to give you just a few quick data points, but you can get this, I think it should come out in a week or two, and you can see some of the broader findings. Now, you all are a very knowledgeable group, so I think you'll figure these out relatively quickly. But what percentage of seniors perceive a strong emphasis, which means very much and quite a bit, on courses focusing on global and international topics? We're going to be very fast today. Raise your hand if you think it's A. 26 perceive that their campus has a strong emphasis on courses focusing on global and international. Okay, what about B? 41%? Okay, C, 54%, and D, 70%. These are our idealists. Okay, and the answer is 54%. Okay, so you've seen some of this NESE. And this is the perception, right? What percentage of students felt their coursework encouraged them to understand viewpoints, values, or customs, of different world cultures? Again, A, 27, B, 45, okay, C, 60, okay, D, 75. We have some folks that have read this, so it is indeed 60%. Again, this is what students are saying, the seniors. Last, what percentage of students frequently attended events or activities that promoted the understanding of different world cultures? Oh, I gave it to you too quickly, sorry. No, and I'm sorry, I think my math didn't convert properly, so 23%. So only 23%, even though they said that the institution encouraged them to take global courses, those kinds of things, 23%. The other thing that was really interesting to find is that during the school year, only 26% of seniors reported that they looked for information about global education programs and opportunities. Those include study abroad, service learning, internships, in the global context, volunteering. And that meant that 74% of seniors did not do this. And that's something that we need to consider in the work that we do going forward. So what about off-campus study? What do we know about off-campus study, aside from the work that you've been doing? Not much. Yeah, not much. So this is an area that we need more research. And this is something where you could really help, as you continue the work you're doing, this would be really, really useful. Of course, like this, I think many of us were talking about being fascinated by this idea of cognitive dissonance and looking at domestic experiences too. And when you have students that are engaged in other work and community, also the mapping of touch points at home and away. What are things that students are doing? I think that's another thing that was quite interesting. So your work is actually quite reflective of what's needed in the field. And I just wanted to affirm that. So the next steps in terms of this work, I think it's important to think about, there are two big areas. One, if you will, is how do we integrate global learning into the institutional internationalization plan? And I'll explain what I mean by that. Secondly is preparing and empowering faculty to do this work. So when we talk about the institutional internationalization plan, I don't know if some of you had a chance to talk to Joe, but he talked about how we have this internationalization which talks about what we hope to do, what we want students to do, the mobility, And then we have global learning outcomes, or we have assessment of global learning, or we're doing the IDI. But on some campuses, there's very little connection between the two. And so as we move forward, it's important that we move together and we start to bring all these things together. So one thing that you did in your white paper, you said, what is global learning? This is what global learning means to us. And, to me, I'm not one that's going to say, oh, use the definition on the value rubric or use this. You use whatever definition works in your context, and then you move forward. And you need to make sure that on your campus that everyone has this same definition. So you're all operating at the same level of knowledge. So when a student is in their physics class and they're talking about global learning, and then they go to their anthropology class, they're talking about the same thing. And when they go to their advisor, they're talking about the same thing. And when they go to their extracurricular or co-curricular activities. So it's really important that you have that shared understanding and a shared definition of what it is that guides the work that you're doing. When we talk about institutional change, it's also important that global learning becomes expected. So when students come to orientation, just like they say, we want to welcome all of the Hoosiers, you're all Hoosiers now, and you're all going to study abroad, or you're all going to engage in global learning. So everything that you expect students to do, you tell them when they come to orientation. And if global is truly a part of what you want your students to do, then it has to be a part of those types of activities. When they go to their school orientation, they go to the College of Arts and Sciences, the dean talks about global engagement, global learning, and those types of things, and that's absolutely essential. Another thing is when you talk to parents, they know that global is something that's going to happen. They know that the student is going to be involved in an off-campus study of some sort. Maybe internationally, maybe in your local community, it might be in the southwest of the US, but you are going to be a part of it, and you communicate this as you do anything else that you consider an important part of the institution. So finally, in this area, it's really important to think about the fact that global learning can't be achieved in a single course. It's something that has to occur along the way. So the work that you're doing with your global learning experiences, with the off-campus study, think about how it fits in this broader picture. And some of you may say, I'm a single faculty member, I am not. You can join the international committee. You can join different, we talked about some folks that said, I'm ready to get off committees, but we encourage you to be that cheerleader and to be the one that says, okay, look, we think it's important that from start to finish, students are engaged in these global activities. So I think when we look at the second point, preparing and empowering faculty to do this work, and I may get this name wrong, we started off with the Red Rock Stars. Is that, okay, the Red Rock Stars, okay? So they actually laid the foundation for one level of what we need to do, is we need to give faculty time and space to think about what they're doing as global learners. You're taking students abroad, but have you unpacked your own perspectives? Have you unpacked what you're thinking and what global learning means to you? Once you have this campus conception of global learning, then you're able to share it with the faculty, share it with staff. And I'm focusing on faculty today because that's been the nature of the work, but this is the same. You share it with any professional on campus so that you all have that perspective, so that a faculty member can say, oh, okay, I see. So for us, it's about appropriately communicating and behaving. Okay, I get it. How would I do that in my field? How will I do that when I take students to this particular area? And so once they're all on board, hopefully, as I said, they'll see the connections. But they also must be invited into the conversation, and they must feel welcome. As someone, I'll give you two quick examples. I've worked with some folks on campuses where folks are in the field of international studies. And they may say, you know, you've moved to this global learning for all. That was my specialty. Where do I fit now? And you tell them you're right at the center, and you help engage them, and you help them see that they are a source of expertise for folks on campus. Same thing with area studies. There's I've spent, I think it was mentioned, I've spent a lot of time in Ghana, in West Africa, and there's a proverb, as the ancestors say, no person surrounds the baobab tree alone, because the baobab tree is huge. So you have to come together with many people. And one of my African Studies colleagues, I'll never forget this, from grad school said, you know, I don't hear you talking about Ghana enough anymore. You keep talking about all these other things. And I said, oh, don't you remember what Osare Kofi told us, that we have to come together? And I said, this is a way for all students to get connected to what's going on in the African continent, what's going on in Asia, is when we all come together and see where we fit. So I think that's absolutely critical. Another thing is good old Dr. Stock, if I got his name right. He will again see that he's a part of a bigger picture and there's a network of people that he can relate to. So I want to talk a bit about equity and the issues of equity and campus collaboration. And this is something that we touched on indirectly a little bit, but we didn't really go deeper into this. And this is something, when we talk about collaboration, again, we want everyone involved. And we also want to think about the fact that if global learning is important for everyone, and we know these skills are valuable, how do we engage everyone? Because it's true, on some campuses, you might get 100% of students to go abroad. But on some campuses, you won't. And so we have to think about what are ways that we can craft multiple experiences that are enriching and meaningful, and how do we create them to ensure? So one of the things that's really important is looking at the data and saying who is participating and who is missing. I don't know if it was you, Iris, who mentioned athletes. You know, you were saying, oh, where are the athletes? Why is it that they can't go? What can we do for them? You know, and so if you pull out that data based on groups and you can figure out, oh, well, if we had an integrated global learning experience, it was part of a core curriculum, everyone would get a touch of this and we would figure out ways to get other students abroad. This is nothing new. Everybody here has seen this data from Open Doors, that 1 in 10 U.S. undergraduates studies abroad for credit before they graduate. And on the bottom, you can see that there have been increases in participation in study abroad by students of color. Those numbers have gone up a bit. But the key is still, there are so many students that aren't going abroad that we have to rethink what we're doing. And I've forgotten, I couldn't read my notes for who this was, but somebody shared a very different map earlier. That was, okay, the rock stars again? Okay. That showed the different locations where students were studying abroad. This is from IIE, so you can see typically this is where the majority of students study abroad. Some institutions that are trying to draw in different students have created programs in different places. For example, the French department, instead of doing programs just in France, and many are doing this now, they're doing programs in Francophone Africa. And so their students are not only learning French language, but you know, one person talked about how their students learned about the negritude and that beautiful artistic period. Another person talked about the fact that their students understood the suburbs of Paris, because they always thought suburbs were where people moved to get away from the city, and they were these lovely areas where you had beautiful lawns and you could have a pool in your yard. And then they learned that in the suburbs of France, you tend to have a lot of folks who are of African descent, North African and Sub-Saharan African descent. And so they were able to unpack some of the issues you may be aware oh my goodness, this was about 6 months ago. There was a young man who was attacked and assaulted by the police, and there were uprisings. And so it really changed the tenor of the kind of conversation they had when they were able to say, okay, we can have multiple experiences. Not to say don't go to Western Europe, but you can have multiple experiences when students are going to some of the less commonly taught places. Other ways that students are engaging, or institutions are trying to engage students, and I'm going to focus on education abroad right now because we've talked quite a bit about the off-campus study, is some institutions, raise your hand if you do this, have a passport program where students can go to a certain number of activities and then they get a passport, you know, at a reduced cost or a free cost. That's something that folks are doing. Do any of your students participate in IFSA Butler programs? I don't know if that's a few. And so they have developed recently a scholarship that students can get for pre-program expenses. So when there's a $500 deposit due, or you have to buy a plane ticket and your financial aid hasn't gone through. And so that's an example of something that people are doing for students that are going abroad to find ways to advance. Also, another thing that institutions are doing is actually offering programs specifically for new majority students. And I had the pleasure of leading a program for 2 years for Indiana University Bloomington. They had a program for new majority students, and it was about the triangular slave trade and African diaspora issues. And so we spent time in Ghana, and then we also went to Liverpool, where you have the International Slavery Museum. University of Liverpool has a lot of information. And so I like to think of myself as a culturally sensitive instructor, and that I'm aware of all these issues. I've read about, the factors that contribute to who's participating. And, we had a number of courses. I think we had 6 or 7 courses in Bloomington before we went to Ghana. And so, this is what I had always done with my other program that was at IUPUI. So 2 weeks before we were leaving, I said to the students, okay, now don't forget, you need to make sure that you have mosquito repellent, a waist belt that goes under your clothes, locks for your luggage, a poncho, and a few other items. So the students nod, class ends. One of my best students comes up to me and says, oh, Dr. Whitehead, I can't go. I said, what do you mean you can't go? Again, this had been like one of the top students, able to make connections. She said, I can't afford any of those things. You already told us what we needed. I paid the $500 because this was subsidized by an endowment. And she said, I just can't go. And I said, well, Amber, I have everything you need. And she said, well, that's good. That's for you. But I don't have it. And I said, Amber, I have to take all of the extras of these items in case students don't have them. And so she finally said, okay, I'll accept it. And the night of our final night in Ghana, after we had our final party, I hear a knock on my door, and it's Amber with all of the stuff, including the mosquito repellent. She said, no, there's half a bottle left, so you take that back. But it was very important to her. And again, this is something I had always done, and I should have done this from the beginning and said, these are things, but I hadn't even considered it. And I should have, because this was a program, again, that was offered for a range of students. One other thing I'll add in this, I can't remember who mentioned this. I didn't catch the name. I think it was our colleague from Guelph. When students, with the work that I did in Ghana, I would always make sure that students had an experience with our African community in town before we went to Ghana. So as you said, the first person they met from Ghana wasn't in Ghana. They had some experience, they understood, they could listen to understand that the accents are different. It doesn't mean they don't speak well. It's a different style of speaking. One other thing, I'll just share 3 quick points from this. So at AAC&U, we have developed to assist us in this idea of broad perspectives of equity, not just for off-campus study or study abroad, there are 3 points about committing to equity and inclusive excellence. And this is a document that can be found on our website as well. The first is committing on your campus to have the frank, hard discussions about equity. And having a goal that there may be a shift in the paradigm, that things may change at your institution as a result of these discussions where you're bringing a lot of people in. Secondly, is that as an institution, you're willing to invest in these culturally competent practices that engage new majority students. And last, that you're willing to set and monitor equity-minded goals. We've got a project with about 15 institutions right now. They're in the 2nd year of the project, and they developed different equity-minded goals that were relevant to their institutional context. A couple of the institutions do have global learning in mind. And so it's really important that you actually talk through these things and say, this is where we are as an institution, and this is what we are willing to do. I think one other thing is when you are engaging your inclusion office or your equity office or your diversity, whatever you call it in your institutional context, there's a lot that can be gained from this. The issue of social justice came up in a couple of presentations, and there is a distinct history. Most of us are familiar with the history. Diversity and equity and inclusion, that work came out of a struggle. It came out of this push to get ethnic studies. We wanted Black studies, we wanted Chicano studies, women's studies, so it was out of a struggle. It was very different than the founding of international education or global learning, as we now call it. And so they're very different histories, and we never want to say, oh, let's all just come together, it's the same thing. It's not, but we can look at the intersection in the middle, and we can try to come together. And when we work with folks who are knowledgeable in this capacity, it helps us, if we're not as familiar, to examine issues of power and privilege. Some of us may not be comfortable, that may not be our academic background, it may not be something that we've done before, but when we engage folks that do this for their living, if you will, do this for their research, it really makes it stronger for our students. It's also important to help with the development of intercultural skills. And I was quite pleased when I was reading the white paper that your definition was DARLAs, because a number of institutions I work with that are trying to bring these worlds together focus on intercultural, because they said sometimes even though global is inclusive and we say global learning, we mean local and global and international, but when they read, the ability to behave and communicate effectively, they say, oh, that can be right here on campus, it can be somewhere else. So the language of intercultural resonates quite a bit with that. One interesting thing when you make some of these connections, I had a dear colleague from Ghana, and he came to the U.S. in the 70s, educated at Swarthmore, then went on to Berkeley, did an MBA, and he's done quite well. But when he first came to the U.S., he wasn't as familiar with Black Americans in the U.S. He knew Black Americans existed, but he didn't have a lot of experience. So he was invited by a Black student to go to the Black Student Union. So he went, had a great time at the meeting, loved it, thought it was wonderful. Then he went back to his room and he talked to his roommate who was white, and he said, hey, you should come to the next meeting. It was great. And he said, oh, well, he said, I'm happy to, but I think, it may serve a different purpose. It might not be. And he said, oh, there were plenty of white people there. And so then he started naming the people, and his friend said, no, they were Black. They were just very fair. And so over time, my friend was able to, and he said, and don't tell them you called them white. But over time, they were able to work with folks in the diversity office to help him understand some of these factors and some of the students. So I think those are some of the things for an international student coming in that can really be helpful. So I think finally, when we think about some of the strategies to make global learning more inclusive, these are things I've already said, changing the institutional culture, and that's something we can't do as individuals. It's something that we have to come together with peers and colleagues and say, we think this is important, or you have a great leader that has this in mind. Again, curricular integration, curricular change, where global learning is integrated in the general ed, in the majors, students see what they need to be doing. Connection to other high impact practices. As I said, we're going to have some good work coming out. I'm expecting to see some work coming from you. And then another thing that a number of institutions are doing is focusing on themes. So they're looking at issues of water. An example, a couple of campuses were working with Flint, and they said, Flint still doesn't have clean water. And they brought together folks who were used to doing work in water in Southeast Asia, and then they looked at what was happening in Flint, and they did a couple of sessions in class. They did water drives. So if you're looking at these broad global themes that one discipline can't solve, that's another way that's really helpful. So this is just one of my mentors. And lastly, I'll take us back to Hamilton and yet another song of Hamilton, which is called Who Tells Your Story? And this is a wonderful song, Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story? And I can't sing well, you can just hear that little. But I think it's important that as from what you have said today, you are in a position to tell stories that haven't been told in this area of global learning, off-campus study, study abroad. And it's important that you tell it so that the same story isn't told over and over again, but there's a new story that needs to be told, so I encourage you to do that. And with that, I think I'll take a few questions. Okay, thanks. Okay, and before questions, on your tables, I changed things quite a bit based on what I was hearing. So I've put something called the Civic Prompts. This is a publication that AAC&U published. Karen McTighe-Musil is the author. And there are a lot of parallels and things that we can pull from the world of civic engagement. And Karen and I have talked about modifying some of the things specifically to say global learning. So I just wanted you to have this resource. In particular, in the back, there are a few questions you can use to guide discussions on campus. But a lot of it, you can just use it to guide your thinking and say, oh, we can do this for global. So that's why I brought that. Yes, ma'am.
Dawn, thank you. That's really inspiring. Thank you very much. That was really cool. And I have a question. You spoke with us about 15 institutions that you're working with, and you mentioned around equity, and you mentioned some things that at least a couple of the institutions are doing around global learning for the sake of meeting equity goals. Could you talk with us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so a couple of and the other reason I'm not saying what the institution are is because they haven't published this yet, but they met, so it's part of a 3-year project. And they were institutions that said, we have gaps in our data. We have gaps in retention, we have gaps in movement from the first year to the second year, we have gaps in graduation rates, we have gaps in participation in certain programming on campus, and then they disaggregated the data and saw who was left out. Some institutions are focusing on males, some are focusing on females, some are focusing on Latino males. It varied in terms of what their gaps were. And then they made the decision to say, okay, based on the team of people, most of them have 6 folks on the team, faculty, professional staff, administrators, and so depending on the composition of their team members, that's how they made the choices. So those 2 institutions that I mentioned, they had people that were from the international office, and that was why they were able to push to make sure that was on the agenda for those institutions.
Fascinating. So they're actually taking steps then to
Yes.
draw them in.
Yes.
Intentionally draw them in.
Exactly. So they're coming up with particular goals. We want to increase the number of students who participate in education abroad, and we want the number of students by this percent, and then they have to develop a plan for how they'll be able to do it. And their institutions, they had to have a senior administrator that could help make these things happen and that could offer some funding as well, which is helpful. Sometimes they've reshuffled funds, others they've looked for grant funds, but that's how the program.
So there's specific diversity targets, and they're using funding to leverage participation.
Yes, and many of them, they are working with their Office of Student Success, and they're able to get funds from that particular office because that's, their charge is how, why is it that students aren't all doing well? And so they work, we worked closely with, I'm gonna get the center's name wrong, USC, Estella Benjamin, I don't know if you know her work, Center on Equity at USC, and I'm happy to share that as well.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you very much.
Oh, yes.
So I appreciated that you talked about the importance of having a shared definition on a campus for global learning. I think that's something we have struggled with over the last 3 years, that we could hardly come to consensus in the room, and we didn't feel like we had a lot of consensus on our campuses. But I don't know if you could maybe talk about schools that kind of had a bottom-up version of consensus, and a school that maybe had a top-down, this is what it means here, but what does it look like to operationalize a definition that everyone can get behind?
I think a bottom-up example, Dominican University in California, it was sort of both. And I think they're a smaller institution, which sometimes makes it easier, sometimes it doesn't. But they were able to, there were folks that were already engaged in this work, and so they were able to come together. Another institution that's not there yet, so I won't say the institutional name, they started with, Lipscomb is another example. Lipscomb University, they're a little bit further. They were able to do this, and the big institution I'll mention was also as part of SACS accreditation. Some of us talked about this last night, because they had to do a quality enhancement plan, and everyone had to be involved. So they had to get buy-in from faculty council and from others to get that definition. I think that's a bottom up, a top down, because of the QEP. Florida International and University of South Florida are both, Keisha can speak to that. I know she's collaborated with them as well. But those are 2 examples of very, very large institutions that they have an operating definition that everyone knows, not just everybody use it. They're supposed to, and they put it on their, syllabi. But we had, I think they were called principles of learning, undergraduate principles of learning, and people would put them without, thinking about it. But I think FIU is a good example, and so is USF. Yes.
I just wanted to add to that, the Institute of International Education did a research on the world of the new classroom, non-credit education abroad. And at the very end of that report, which is like a 36-page report, is very great. They have looked at operating definition that I think is a good starting point. And yes, it's just something.
Yeah, and I'll add, again, this is not we don't benefit from this. But if you go to the AAC&U website, look for global learning, we have examples, including Kennesaw State, since David's here. We've got definitions and learning outcomes and global learning outcomes from institutions that we've gathered. So if you want to get started, the idea is if you see them, it helps you get the conversation started. Some other institutions have started with faculty learning communities centered around global issues, centered around study abroad, centered around other issues, and then it has spread out, and then they've found more success.
Now, on returning to the equity question, the new majority students, many of them spending a considerable amount of time in community colleges, many of them taking courses online, where those courses typically do not have global learning experiences, that is experiential types of projects, either domestic or plus international. You know, does the trend in terms of expansion of that new majority, this type of student, it seems what I've read is that's expected to expand.
Yes.
Along with the greater vocationalism, or vocationalism. What does that portend for the two-tier system of higher ed, and especially education abroad, which increasingly, apart from students who get scholarships or endowed to travel, becomes a very affluent white undertaking, or middle class person would call it, that is social class based, whereas we have another tier. And what models have you come across that tries to bring global learning into that first tier of low income, career oriented, laden with family responsibilities?
I think Ivy Tech State College in the state of Indiana actually, they have done a lot in that area, and they've developed their own global learning outcomes, they've had a couple of education abroad experiences, but it was because they had an outside funder. Coke is a big corporate in that area. They supported it for a few years, but then they stopped. And so they have focused on how do we do this in the curriculum for two-year students. So that's one example, and Ivy Tech is all around the state of Indiana. And I'm going to get the name wrong, Stella Gutman Community College in New York. They have also done quite a bit. It's a two-year college. And LaGuardia Community College. Those are kind of the, people always refer to them because they're always doing innovative things. They have been developing some rubrics based on our rubric, and they've been developing a cohort of students who have gone on a short-term study abroad program, and then they come back and they do different things on campus. So I think those are some examples. But I know some of the smaller, Finger Lakes Community College in upstate New York, they have been trying to add some global perspectives, but they're focused on, we're doing it through the curriculum because we know we have working students who aren't going to be able to travel. I think some, and LaGuardia has done this, and so has Gutman, they have looked at ways for students to connect online. And so if it is an online course, is there a way that you can bring in folks from outside the US to have conversations in forums, or to have different sessions where you're bringing in different voices so they at least have that? So I think that's one example that they piloted at a small level. I think her name is Katie Wilson. I can't remember her last name, but I know she's been trying to do some of those things for their students that are unable to go abroad. But I think you're right, and I think to me that's why, and I want students to go abroad, and I think it's absolutely important that they can. But even those who do go abroad, if they can have that embedded global learning experience before they go, it makes it even richer when they do go. And so I think that's why it's important that we have opportunities working with our local communities. I hate to keep calling on Keisha, but she's been involved at Florida Memorial. But there was a project between the Appalachian College Association and select members of historically black colleges and universities, and they did an exchange, a research exchange, so that students from Clark Atlanta spent time at Lindsey Wilson. Students at Lindsey Wilson spent time at Clark Atlanta. They went to Coca-Cola, these corporations that were international and global in nature. So I think those are some of the kinds of things. But the online, I think, is a big challenge, and I'm seeing a few places that are addressing that. Okay.